When I was younger, I used to live in an apartment complex in a really bad part of town. My parents used to let me play in front of our door as long as somebody was watching, which was usually my mom. Things were fine until about a year later. A young man whom my parents thought was a shady character would frequent the apartments to hang out with a few of his buddies, to drink and do drugs, specifically heroin. While he would be waiting for them, I would be outside playing. I didn't even notice him, watching me and smiling to himself. Although I didn't remember much about him at the time, I could only describe him as a strong and muscular man, with an ominous vibe about him. Anyways, hour after hour, this man would sit on the steps of our apartment and try and play with me. Being the overprotective mother that she was, my mom would take me back inside and not let me go back out until he left. This kept happening more and more, and finally it died down when my brother was born, and then it got much worse. Now I was 4 and my brother was 1. We were playing while my mom was doing laundry, and I spot the guy hiding in a bush near my neighbor's apartment. It looked like he had something hidden behind his back. We made eye contact, and I kid you not, he gave us the most devilish smile I've ever seen in my life. Instantly I got very uncomfortable and creeped out, so I called out to my mom. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her to the best of my 4-year-old abilities. Immediately she dropped what she was doing, grabbed both of us and took us inside. At first I didn't know why she took us in, but now that I'm older, I'm grateful she did. Later that night there was a shoutout between him and the neighbors. He had a gun on his person and ended up shooting a member from a rival gang and escaping. Fast forward 9 years later, I came across an article from our local newspaper about a guy who had been sentenced to life without parole for gunning down a rival gang member. The second my mom saw the article, she explained that it was the guy who used to watch me when I was younger. Apparently he was from a local gang and used to be in and out of prison. That alone was enough for me to get my heart pumping. When I was 11, my family of 6 decided to make the move from suburbia to a lovely rural bungalow. I have 3 sisters ages 9, 12, and 18 at the time. We were all excited for the privacy and isolation of our new home. For once in our lives, we would have no neighbors and a large yard to play in. Our home had large picture windows giving us a beautiful view of the farmland around us. My parents dislike curtains because they collect dust, and since there was no neighbors, we all figured, what's the point? The summer there was so much fun. Every morning I would get up and take my dog for a walk around the woods in our backyard. I absolutely adored the feeling of being alone and was enjoying the freedom of all our new space. Fall eventually rolled around and I continued my routine of walking my dog both in the morning and after school. I remember one morning while walking my dog, I began feeling uncomfortable. I was alone in the woods and there was no one else around, but I still felt as though I was being watched. I had shivers down my back the entire walk, and for an 11-year-old I just felt really strange. My dog was acting weird too. I kept trying to go further into the woods, but she kept trying to pull me back towards our shed. The shed rested at the very back of our yard, on the edge of the woods, where the trees thin out quite a bit. I didn't like how I was feeling, so I picked up my dog and brought her back to the house and went on with my day. Days went by, and I just couldn't seem to shake this feeling of being watched, especially when I was in my bedroom, which had a huge window in it that overlooked our backyard. The view of the woods that I had previously loved was beginning to scare me. I assumed it was just because it was fall and the forest started looking kind of gloomy. I started having nightmares about waking up in the middle of the night and seeing the figure of a man in our backyard. Weird things kept happening around our house. We suddenly noticed that we were eating things like bread a lot quicker. Every morning, half a loaf of bread would be gone, and my parents attributed this to their hungry growing children. One evening I woke up and heard noises coming from our kitchen, which was down the hall from my bedroom. It sounded like someone had come home, and I assumed it was my oldest sister. The only thing that was strange was that her footsteps sounded a lot heavier than they usually do. The noises stopped very quickly and I was able to fall back asleep. In the morning, my mom asked me and my two sisters, ages 9 and 12, if we woke up last night to make food. We all said no, and then I asked if it was my oldest sister. My mom told me that she stayed at her friend's house last night, and then thought it was probably the dog making the noises. I became terrified, because I knew I heard unfamiliar footsteps. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, it felt like someone was watching me. Eventually, I fell asleep, but woke up around 2:30 a.m. I heard noises in the house again. It was the same footsteps I heard before. I stayed in my bed and felt paralyzed. I rolled over and faced the window, hoping that if someone came in my room, they would think I was asleep. The noises stopped, and I closed my eyes as hard as I could. I told myself that I was just imagining things, and that monsters aren't real. About an hour must have gone by, and I eventually opened my eyes. When I looked out the window, I swear to God, I could see a man standing in our backyard, watching our house. I was terrified enough that I didn't move at all, and eventually fell asleep again. I was so relieved to wake up alive that morning, but I was still terrified of our backyard. I ran into the kitchen to tell my mom what I saw and refused to walk the dog. I'm not sure if she really believed me at the time or thought I was having a night terror, which I did quite often when I was younger. I went to school that morning. Throughout the day I was very anxious. The last thing I wanted to do was go home. When I did get home, I saw police vehicles surrounding the house. They had the dogs with them and were searching our yard. They told us a man who had broken into another home and had beaten the couple living there was suspected of being on our property. He stole their wallets, photos, and other small items of value. The biggest thing he took was their car, which had been ditched 10 kilometers from our home. While searching our property, they found all the items from the previous break-in, hidden around our yard. They also discovered that he had been hiding in our shed since his previous break-in. They said he had done this at the previous home prior to breaking in. He would spend time watching the house and observing the residents' routine until he knew it well enough to start coming inside the house. They said he had a long history of premeditated violence, including child abuse, and believed he was planning on eventually harming us. In the shed they found wrappers, empty cans of food, and scraps. They told us he was definitely coming into our house for the food during the night. From the shed, he had a perfect view of our home and could see when we all went to bed. Although they searched our house and property with the dogs, they didn't find him. After that day, I realized if you feel like you're being watched, you probably are. I'm from the UK, and this story took place around 6 years ago when I was 15. It happened to me and my best friend Sabrina. It was exam time. We were stressed, hungry, and wanted to get home following our geography exam. The walk from school to my house took around 15 minutes, and it was along a main road, so we had no creeper issues, until now. As we were approaching the park that has a bus stop outside it, a bus pulled up, like it always does, and people piled out of the doors. Nothing unusual. That was until me and Sabrina noticed this woman getting off the bus. My gut instantly turned, and although she hadn't said a word to us, there was something just off about her. For one, she was dressed in a heavy winter coat and sported leather gloves. My mom had bought some for herself over the winter, so I thought it was just a trend. But then I realized it was June. She reminded me of Myra Henley. Google her if you don't know her. Horrible woman. And I didn't feel comfortable around her at all. So we were walking closer to her in order to get to my house, and she simply stood there staring at me and Sabrina. As I got closer, I noticed she had very heavy eye makeup on, almost smudged, and then she smiled. Oh God, that smile sent shivers down my spine, but we managed to get past her, and I let out a sigh of relief. Something still didn't feel right, so I turned back and she was now facing us again, but standing still and simply watching us walk away. Me and Sabrina broke into a light jog. My house was only 5 minutes away, so I turned back again, and she had disappeared. I remember being terribly confused as the main road was straight, no shops or houses during that small stretch, only the park, which was also empty. However, my house was still in viewing distance, so I told Sabrina to stay at mine for a while because I still couldn't shake off that nagging feeling of something not being quite right. I made us some snacks, then I decided I would look out my grandmother's bedroom window. Her window faces towards the road, which is great if you were looking out for an ice cream truck. But what I saw made my heart sink. It was the same woman from before, only this time she was walking towards my house, and she seemed to be looking for something, or someone. I yelled out to Sabrina to come see what was happening. She couldn't possibly have seen us as we were looking through drawn curtains, thinking it would protect us. She got closer and just stopped at the driveway between mine and my neighbor's house. We were shitting ourselves at this point, peeking over every so often to see if she was gone. What happened next forever haunts me. She turned her head towards my grandmother's window and mimicked the gesture for throat cutting with a smile. I didn't even care that she had seen us at that point. I was so shocked at how unsafe I felt in my own house. I opened the window and screamed at her to go away. Her smile dropped and she shot me the most evil look before turning on her heels and walking away, stopping at the end of the road to look back and mimic her action again. Me and Sabrina were too scared to even move for the next hour until my mom got home. Every noise made us fear for our lives. We told my mom everything, who made us some ice cream sundaes and called my school and the non-emergency number for the police, who thanked her and told her that they would keep an eye out for her. It scares me how she followed us back and how she could have hurt us if she wanted to, as no one was home except for me and Sabrina. I had nightmares about her for a good year or so after the incident, and I never wished to see her again, ever. Back in 2013, I was at university. It was in England and in the countryside, and the uni has lots of accommodations, a few shops, banks, and a great nightlife. It's also surrounded by woodland and a couple of lakes. Some of you may already know where this is. I'm going to preface this story by saying that during the time I went there had been a few attacks on girls late at night, so the university had installed extra lighting in one area. This incident happened before the extra lighting had been installed. I was aware to keep myself safe, but I also want to state that I was not just drunk, but totally wasted when this incident occurred, so please forgive my lack of sensible decision making. I had been getting drunk with a guy I was seeing at the time. After we were very wasted, we decided to walk back from the lake near the woods. To get back to my accommodation, we had to walk through the main busy part of campus, then through an isolated part, passing through a small field and a wooded area, until you get to a path that leads to the accommodation. I never would have walked this at night on my own. As we were walking, I spot this girl, slightly shorter than me, very pretty with blonde hair. I noticed her because of how out of it she looked, and the fact that she was walking in an odd way. She was actually walking in the same direction as us, and speeds up towards us, then goes right past. A minute later, a guy passes by us too. There was nothing weird about this in itself, because there's obviously going to be students walking back to their rooms after the club closes. But despite being drunk, I just got this odd feeling. I told the guy I was with I had a feeling that we should speed up, and he told me that I was just being dramatic. He would later eat these words. At the time, for some reason, I had the foresight to mentally note what the guy looked like and what he was wearing. He was tall and skinny and had brown short hair and had on one of those studded belts that you never see nowadays. I sped up because, like I said, I had this weird gut feeling. My male companion speeds up with me. We got to the bottom of these concrete stairs, and after that is the wooded area. Just as we turned the corner, my heart sank. I could see the guy walking faster to the girl on the field, clearly drunk. Both me and the guy just froze, I think out of fear of overreacting. The next part nearly made me sick because of how quickly it happened. The guy pounced on the girl and she fell. He then grabbed her and started dragging her by her limp arms to the wooded area near the field. We were about 40 meters away, give or take, in a position where we could see them and they couldn't see us. The guy I was with threw his backpack to the floor and sprinted towards the guy. The guy had obviously noticed him. At this point, I was running towards the scene too. The guy I was with pushed the creep away pretty forcefully. I ran to the girl and helped her up, trying to ask her where she lived and what her name was, etc. She was totally out of it. Please bear in mind, both myself and the guy I was with were drunk. Had I been of sound mind, I would have handled this situation differently than I had and called the police or campus security there and then. The creep proceeded to shout at us and tell us that it was his girlfriend and he was getting her home, and that she was drunk and they had an argument. He assured us that he was getting her home, and the guy I was with believed him and told me that we should leave them alone. Looking back in a sober perspective, I realize that this doesn't explain him trying to drag her into the wooded area. So we let them go ahead, but I tell the guy I'm with, I'm going to follow them. At this point, the guy I was with begins to get annoyed at me, really annoyed. I guess he was in a rush to get me back to my place and was also totally drunk and not thinking clearly. We were whisper arguing and had only moved slightly, but the guy had made a considerable distance from us with the girl. It was difficult to see them because we were standing in an illuminated area and they were ahead of us in the darkness. I didn't want to go back to my place and knew I had to keep an eye on the girl. Then we saw it again. Brazenly and foolishly, this guy started dragging her towards the woods again. My male companion obviously realized he definitely wasn't her boyfriend and made another sprint towards him. This time the creep sprinted off in the other direction. I got my phone out and called campus security, and we took her back to her building while we waited for them to take over. The next day I had to make a statement in writing. I found out from the lady who was ahead of the resident support network the girl was doing fine and her friends were made aware of the situation. And she was being walked to and from places with security on speed dial. Unfortunately, I don't know who the man was and what happened with him. Please be careful when walking home. Always go with a friend, even if you think it's somewhere safe, like university or your own neighborhood. Around about 9 months ago, me and my partner had just bought our new 6-month-old boxer to keep our 3-year-old Labrador company and decided it would be a good idea to take them both for a walk in the countryside. We live close to a large city called Hull in northeast England. We decided to go for a walk in the ruralish area north of the River Humber that ran through to the sea. Upon getting to a village close to a local landmark, a World War II Army fort, we chose to walk close by and through the small patches of forest close to the nature reserve. We walked along a grass bunker toward the forest, and suddenly my partner pointed out 2 young men had began walking up the bank from the woods in a diagonal manner, as if they were trying to cut us off. From close by, I wondered if the young men had attended some sort of World War II reenactment, as they were both wearing camouflage pants and were also covered in head to toe in dust and dirt. I thought nothing of the both of them, as I was sure they would pass us, but as they grew closer, it appeared they were aimingly walking towards us. They were at least 10 feet away when they stopped, and one of them spoke up. The way he spoke still bothers me when I think back on it. He seemed to have a disregard for manners or even trying to make sense. The young man wanted to know where we were planning on walking, and we told him we weren't really sure, and would just see where we ended up. The young man looked disappointed by this and suggested that we should take his route, which went through the forest to what he described as a great place to sightsee and sit. While the young man was telling us this, the other boy kept watch on our 2 dogs almost constantly, as if he wanted to make sure they were always in his sight. We didn't have much knowledge of this area and had not seen any other dog walkers, so we took the young man's advice after they pointed to an opening in the woods, and we walked on. The woods blocked out about 30% of the sunlight, and as I looked back I saw the young men had not walked off, but were watching us walk into the forest. The path looked as though it was man-made, as it seemed to be the only walkable area throughout that forest. About 2 minutes into the track, our Labrador began sniffing behind a bramble bush, which at first we thought nothing of, as both dogs sniff everywhere they can whenever we walk them. However, she began sniffing in one spot in particular and started rolling on the floor. We went over to her and saw that she was sniffing some sort of shattered rubber pig mask with brown and red liquid on it. It looked disgusting, and my partner forced the dog away from it, as it looked as though fleas were crawling all around it. Further into the walk, the woods had turned into a long path of trees and bushes that had become very narrow, but we could see a turn far ahead, and we agreed that if it led nowhere, we would turn back. I walked ahead and was on my phone preparing to take a photo of the woods when I felt several pricks on my neck, chin, and a part of my face. I let out a gasp to alert my partner, and he told me to stand still in a very alarmed way, followed by him carefully removing thin pieces of string away from my face. As it turns out, someone had tied fishing hooks on lines to a tree in the walkway. It's safe to say that we were both terrified, confused, and angry after this point, and hurried back to the car and left to go home. I don't want to sound cliche or anything, but as we drove off, I swear I could see someone through the back mirror peek out into the road. I don't know 100% whether or not the person who laid out the fish hooks were the people we talked to, although it would make sense. Some detail for a good mental image. I live in a massive subdivision that surrounds a bunch of woods, affectionately referred to as the trails. I suppose the people who own it left it untouched in case they wanted to add more streets. Anyway, I live down the street from one of the main entrances that most people use and know of. My friends and I were a resilient bunch who like to go out and have fires, get drunk, and smoke a little, if you know what I mean. So considering we were out there so much, we decided to go build ourselves a little hideout fort where we could party and even camp. We ended up with a good small clearing off of one of the winding paths, where we had set up a good-sized lean-to with some evergreen on top as our roof, and named it Bear Cave. Now for the incident in question. This happened back when I was about 17 or 19 years old. I had just gotten off work and had gone to grab some fast food. My friends had called me earlier letting me know that they were going to meet up at Bear Cave, so after I got home and changed into some warmer clothes, as this was in the late fall to early winter and it had been unusually cold that night, I decided I should go out there as soon as possible and to take my food with me and eat it there. Now it's about 8:30 and the moon was barely visible through the trees, but knowing the trail like the back of my hand, I wasn't too worried and assumed they would already be there and have a fire started. As I approached, I walked up to our hidden entrance and saw that there was no fire and heard no sounds. I took my phone out and texted someone asking where they were. They replied something along the lines of, "Sorry man, we're gonna be about 15 minutes. Great, I thought to myself. I ducked in and started to scrape together some wood so I could get something started. Unfortunately, everything was wet and without a proper flashlight. This was before they were standard on phones. I couldn't get into the brush and dig anything up. Soon after, I decided I might as well scarf down my 2 burgers I brought with me. Before I knew it, I'd been sitting out there for maybe about 20 minutes, and there was no sign of anyone. I tried giving a couple of my friends a call, and after 5 minutes with no call back, I texted them. Still no response. At this point, I was about fed up and my phone was about to die, so I made a mental note. 10 more minutes, and I'm gone. At this point, I squatted down, holding my knees to my chest, trying to get warm. To my back was our little hut we had built. I thought I heard something behind me, a slight crunch. I looked over my shoulder, and from behind the shelter, I saw what looked like two beady eyes glinting from the little moonlight entering through the trees. I quickly and quietly turned my full body to face it. At this point, I felt like I was going to throw up or shit myself. But keeping my mind about myself, I slowly reached to my right, where I had laid a stick just in case something like this happened. If this was a dog, it was huge. And let me just clarify, this was not a wolf, as I live in the South, and coyotes do not get this big. Something wasn't right. It just stared at me unblinking, as if through me, and made no sound whatsoever. I realized whatever this was wanted to come at me. Thinking fast, I decided my best option was to throw it off guard. I threw the stick, and without turning to see if it made contact, I ran swiftly out of the entrance, expertly placing my feet in all the safe places through the trail, assuring I wouldn't trip, though maintaining max speed. I didn't stop until I saw the streetlights and was safely in the road. About this time, I see my friends pulling up, and all I told them was that I saw something. They didn't seem too interested, and proceeded to the entrance. I sternly told them no, and suggested that we just go to my house. This seemed suitable to them, and so we went. I still don't know what I saw out there, and it was as though everyone forgot about it. I continued to go back out there, but only at daytime, or if at nighttime, I would only go out there with a friend. But I will never forget those unwavering eyes. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in the Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin, and after our experience, we do not plan to return unless we go with a large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for R&R. We've done a number of hiking trips in northern Wisconsin, but never to this area. We are not backpacking experts, but we've been to a number of national forests and have been hiking and exploring when we can find the time away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of the North Country Trail. The North Country Trail is a scenic route, like the Appalachian, but it gets much less used. In some parts of northern Wisconsin, the trail is very remote, and the only access is through logging roads. We plan to hike 15 miles along the trail to a backpack shelter, spend the night, and walk back to the car the following day. We spent the night at a friend's house in Wausau, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forest. I drove slowly along the gravel logging roads as we made our way to our parking spot. While we were driving to the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted-out, banged-up pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved, and they stared back without returning the greeting. Friendly people, I thought to myself. After we passed them, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed they were still staring at us. And before we rounded a bend, I glanced back into the mirror again and saw them watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about it, but we didn't think anything of the encounter. Aside from those people, we did not encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the national forest boundary. We found a trailhead about 15 minutes later. After winding our way on the narrow logging road, there was no one else parked at the trailhead. A perfect chance to get some needed solitude, fresh air, and relaxation. After parking and making sure our car was locked, we hoisted on our packs and set off on the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We took pictures along the way, and we marveled at the lushness of the forest and the topography of the glacial moraine. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of a wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter fire ring, and I boiled water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we watched the sky slowly turn dark. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures we took that day, but after lugging a heavy backpack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at state and national parks, I usually wore earplugs, but that night there were no RVs or other campers to make noise. So I closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me into sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted off to sleep, but we awoke to a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch black outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like someone was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point, and we lay silently in our tent, hearing the noise again. The backpacking tent that we were using had no windows. We could only guess what was making the noise outside our tent. We initially thought an animal got at our food and garbage bag, which we left in the shelter, but the noise was too distinct, and it did not sound like rustling through our food wrappers or camp equipment. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the persistent knock in the darkness. Unarmed and scared shitless, we did not know what to do. I would normally have carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home and save the weight against the wishes of my girlfriend. The knocking continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making the noise had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking sound ceased. We lay in complete silence with only the dull buzz of the insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking. Voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We could not make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people were talking. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices did not seem to be getting louder. Whoever it was did not spot the tent or decided to leave us alone. We sat in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At first light, we slowly got out of the tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anyone was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp pads and put our tent away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word "kill" was cut into the shelter wall, and there were a number of axe and knife cuts where someone was chopping at the wall. I looked at the ground and saw a scattering of fresh wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with our gear as we made our way back to the car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing out through the woods to see if anyone was following us. We traversed the glacial eskers that we saw the day before, and we knew we were getting close to our car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the trailhead. We made it back to the trailhead in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there was something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield, and a squirrel carcass was impaled on the wiper blade. Hair and blood was still stuck to the wiper and on the hood of the car. I didn't bother cleaning off the car. We threw our gear in the trunk and sped off without removing the animal from the wiper blade. As I sped down the gravel logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but I could not see anything through the cloud of road dust behind the car. When we got to the gas station by the nearest town, I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper, and I tried to remove as much dried blood as I could. I filled up on gas, and we didn't stop until we made it back to Milwaukee. This was the last trip I took to the woods of northern Wisconsin. My mom told me a story not too long ago that really made me freak out. Well, let me start off by saying that I've been trying to find something to back up her story on the net, but I can't find anything as this happened in 1986. My mom and dad lived in Winfield, Louisiana, way out in the woods. It was 20 miles away from any real civilization. They lived in a trailer on a ton of land they were trying to sell, so they could move to Shreveport. The reason being is that my mom was pregnant with me, and they wanted me to be able to have a relationship with my grandparents, so this is where we begin. One day while my dad was at work, my mom was home alone with her white German Shepherd, Sheba. She was doing something in the kitchen when she heard someone knock on the door. She goes to answer the door, and there was this really tall man standing there. Then Sheba starts barking like crazy and biting at the door, trying to attack the man. According to my mom, she never acted this way before. She pushes Sheba back and asks, "Can I help you?" The man answers,
"Well, I just wanted to stop by and look at your house to see if I wanted to make an offer."
My mom, being somewhat desperate to sell the house, agreed to let him in and look around. Before she let him in, she grabbed Sheba and put her outside so that the man could look around in peace. Sheba became more aggressive and determined to get in the house. She bit and growled at the door. Mom kinda shrugged it off, not really thinking why Sheba was acting so crazy towards the man. So as the man walks in, he glances over the very small living room, barely paying any attention to the house, and looking at my mom with a weird stare and standing really close to her. He then says,
"I need to call my wife about the house. Can I use your phone?"
My mom agrees and told him where it was on the counter. My mom kind of walks off in the kitchen and notices he didn't dial any numbers. He was talking really low on the phone. He says,
"Hey Lucy, yeah, I really like the house. I think you will too. Okay then, I'll talk to you later. Bye, honey."
He then puts the phone down on the hook, but not all the way. He then turns to my mom and says,
"How much do you want for this house?"
Then that's when my mom heard the phone. It was making that noise it makes when you leave it off the hook. She got scared but tried not to show it, and said, "My husband is going to be here in 10 minutes. You could talk to him about that." The man stares at her for a minute. Mom was crying on the inside, but she never acted like she was scared, and she stood her ground. He then says,
"I better go."
Then goes towards the door. The door opens. Sheba jumps on him and attacks the man's legs. He runs to his truck, Sheba at his heels. And without saying another word to my mom, he left. After he was gone, Mom freaked out and called my dad. A few days later, she was reading the newspaper and saw a police drawing of a man that was wanted for murdering women that were home alone, using the excuse he wanted to buy their homes, earning him the title, the real estate killer. It was the man that came to the house. My mom freaked out. The mystery was solved. Sheba was acting that way because he was going to hurt my mom, and he left the phone off the hook so she couldn't call for help, I assume. Needless to say, my mom never showed the house alone again. She thanks God that her and I weren't killed that day. She thinks the reason he didn't do anything is because she didn't show any fear when things were getting strange. It's crazy to think I may have never been born because of some murderer. I just discovered this sub recently, so first time poster here. I'm using a throwaway account because some of my friends know of my main one, and I haven't shared this story with many people, mostly out of avoidance of judgment, because I know I didn't make the best choices here. Being a 26-year-old woman who enjoys her independence and goes out a lot alone, I don't have a shortage of these stories, unfortunately. But this happened about a month ago and it's still fresh in my mind. I work for a national nonprofit organization and work remotely from my home in Michigan, but I am sometimes asked to travel. In early July, I had to fly to DC for a series of meetings with about 10 other staff members, who were all out-of-towners and would be staying at the same hotel. I was on the plane and I realized I forgot my cigarettes at home, and by the time I landed in Washington, hopped in a taxi to the hotel and threw my bags in the room, I was jonesing super hard. It was already late by then, almost 11 o'clock at night, and despite my better judgment, I looked on my phone for the nearest Walgreens so I could pick up a couple of packs for the week. I decided it was too late to call one of my work friends who I knew was already in the hotel to walk with me. And while I consider myself a fairly cautious person, and wouldn't normally go exploring an unknown neighborhood alone in the middle of the night, my nicotine craving won out. I headed out for the nearest drugstore, or at least the nearest my phone picked up on, which was about 10 blocks away. While the hotel was situated on a busy, well-traveled street with lots of bars and restaurants, I pretty quickly realized the turn I had to take to the store put most of my trip on a much more secluded, darker stretch. I also realized just how long 10 blocks actually was. Lots of boarded-up shops and homeless people lined the neighborhood. I always make it a point to carry some extra cash on me when I'm in the city to give to folks who need it. I blew through that pretty quickly. I could feel occasional eyes on me as I passed by, and someone yelled something from across the street, just some standard innocuous, "Hey, how's it going" shit. All that being said, the trip there was uneventful. After getting out of the store, I immediately paused out front to light up, when a guy who was standing along the side of the store building, the store was right up against an alley, called me over. He was standing maybe about 7 feet away, leaning just inside the entrance to the alleyway. I ignored the first couple of "heys" and started to turn to head back to my hotel in the opposite direction. But he let out a really aggressive, "Bitch, I'm talking to you," which made me jump and instinctively whip my head around. Mistake number one. Just looking in his direction was an invitation for further interaction. His voice calmed. He asked me for a cigarette, and still taken aback, I shuffled over to him in this alley, where I really couldn't get a good look at him at first. I handed him a cigarette and my lighter. He asked me what a little girl like me was doing out all alone. I stammered something. Then he asked me if I wanted to go party. I told him no, and that I needed to be heading back now. I remember not wanting to tell him where back was, because I didn't want to reveal that I was from out of town and completely unfamiliar with the area. After a minute or two of this, he grabbed my arm around my elbow, while he kept insisting how fun it would be. I tried to slide my arm out of his grip, not super aggressively, but just enough to signify that I was not about this. But he tightened his grip. What he was doing wasn't overtly aggressive either. It was just like he was trying really hard to convince me. But then he put his other hand on my back and just held it there, and told me he lived just a couple of blocks down the street and he would show me a really good time. We could smoke, put on music, whatever. Without removing either hand, he started to lead me out of the alley entrance and down the street in the opposite direction I had just come from. By now, I was totally flipping shit internally, and even though I was trying my best not to let it show, my voice was quivering a bit when I asked him to please take his hands off me, and that I needed to get home. Without removing either hand, he just laughed and kept me moving. His laugh was disgusting. I was scanning the street for someone to try to flag down for help, but I didn't see anyone up ahead. He just kept muttering, now more to himself than to me, about what a good time we were going to have, and how I was such a cute little girl. After about half a block, when his hand slid a bit lower, I finally snapped out of my trance and started to struggle. I now yelled at him to let me go and tried to push him off of me. He resisted me and tried to pull me into the shadows of the storefront we were standing in front of, out of the way of the streetlights, and kept telling me, now angrily, but not yelling, to be a good girl. In the midst of this, he had me held tight. He then pulled my body against his. This felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than a couple of seconds, before I was able to somehow push him, elbow him, knee him, whatever I could do, and break free. As soon as I was out of his grasp, I started to bolt back in the opposite direction, and I heard him yelling out all sorts of colorful names behind me. I didn't look back for what felt like forever, and when I finally did, I was relieved to see that he wasn't following me. That didn't stop me from running another few blocks until I was completely out of breath and near hysterical. I called one of my coworkers and could barely get the story out between my sobs, and he was insistent upon me going to the nearest open store, which was a McDonald's, and wait for him to meet me there. I sat away from the windows but kept my eyes locked on the door as best I could from where I was sitting, terrified that the creep had somehow seen me walk in. The person I called and another male coworker were there in less than 10 minutes. I work with some seriously awesome people, and they walked me all the way back to my hotel room door. I was still completely rattled, and so they called yet another coworker to get in on my drama, and she came and spent the night in my room with me. All three of them insisted I call the police, but I just didn't want to deal with it. I just wanted to put it behind me and get on with the rest of the week. Honestly though, a month later, and it's still not entirely behind me, and I can't help to think about the next close call that could always be right around the corner. Fuck that guy for making me feel so entirely unsafe and insecure. So this story happened back when I was in 5th grade in 2005, when I lived in western Montana. My bedroom was shared with my 2nd grade sister, and we had a king-size bed that we both slept on. To describe our house a bit, our room was facing the backyard, but was a basement room. Basically standing up looking out the window in my room, I was eye level with the ground outside. Up and to the left above my window, I could see onto our deck, which looked into our upstairs kitchen. Kind of confusing, but bear with me. Anyways, this particular night, my sister and I were having a sleepover, and our friend was in the bed with us. When we were falling asleep around 1 a.m., our friend woke us up to show us that a deer was on our deck. We looked out, and we all saw a deer on the deck. This was normal in Montana, so we laid back down. I guess my friend stayed up and stared at it. She woke us up 5 minutes later, saying that she actually thought it was a person. Right then we all looked at it, and we saw the shadow move a little. It was clearly a tall person's silhouette. We all started freaking out, and then we saw 2 green laser lights. They were just 2 small pinpoint lights that were coming from the guy's head area. We all thought it was binoculars. At this point we were on high alert, and our eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and we saw it was clearly a guy looking into our kitchen window. I was too scared to go tell my parents all the way upstairs and past the view of the guy looking in the window. So we used my friend's cell phone and called the house phone. Neither me or my sister owned cell phones at the time. The phone rang loudly, and we watched the guy run full speed off the deck. As soon as he ran away, the 3 of us ran screaming upstairs and told my dad. He called the cops and they searched the streets, but they never found the guy. Now here's where things get weird. So just 2 weeks earlier, the town's police station sent around notices in our neighborhood telling us that a person of interest and dangerous sexual predator who had a warrant out for his arrest had been spotted in our area. A tip had said he was staying with a family member 3 streets down from us. I remember this because I remember my mom, who was a bit paranoid, drove us by the address of the house and made us very aware of what was going on, and would not let us ride our bikes outside during this time. I remember looking at the house every time we drove by it. Turns out, 2 or 3 months later, this same man was apprehended for the kidnappings, abuse, and murders of 2 children and killing their families in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, only 2 hours away from my house. In some of his interrogations, he confessed to stalking the kids by watching their homes at night with night vision goggles. I also found some obscure website that had some of his writings where he discussed living in Montana and talked about how right before killing this family, he was searching for children to kidnap. We were around the same ages as the kids who were taken by him. I have no proof that he was the person looking into our window that night, but the evidence all adds up for me, down to the timeline and the area I lived at the time. I don't want to go into too much detail of his crimes. They were all over the news, and you can read about them in various articles online. I researched this guy in depth, and he was a sick motherfucker. He allegedly has encrypted diaries of his crimes and filmed the tortures he committed, so I consider myself blessed. Hopefully he stays locked up, so I never have to meet him. So I recently started school again, and as part of my daily routine, I'm required to travel to Toronto Monday to Friday via train and subway lines. It's about a good 2 hours one way. So I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones, and relax to some light music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of the horror stories that many people have experienced on public transportation. Naturally, I thought most of it was just over-exaggeration and tall tales. However, I was very quickly proven dead wrong. Rewind to about a week ago. I had just finished a very long, grueling day of school, 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., and I wanted nothing more than to just relax and get home as soon as possible. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly next to an exit door. Now, a little context. I am facing forward, looking at the one seat ahead of me across the aisle of the subway car. This seat was occupied by a 20-something Asian lady who was playing some game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. Next to the seat opposite me is another seat facing the Asian lady, and it's this person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying the seat was a lady about 30 to 40 years of age who possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling, and I mean she was smiling the entire subway ride. Anyways, the car pulled out of the station, and we were on our way. For the first half of my trip, she would continuously be staring at this Asian girl, laughing and muttering to herself. She would also take her phone out of her purse and started taking pictures of this girl. How the Asian lady did not see this, I still have no clue. About halfway up the tracks, the Asian lady left the car, and this is where the attention was directed to me. She turned towards me and just smiled at me with a huge toothy grin. I knew deep down that if I made eye contact, I was going to be in for a bad time. So I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually, she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague and went to plan B. She opened her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste, Colgate was written on the side, and proceeded to ingest roughly half of the tube. I damn near threw up then and there. Somehow, I held it together. My stop came, and I bolted from that car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and glanced back, and guess who I see fast walking after me, arms at her side, still smiling. I was understandably shitting my pants, terrified by this point. I ran out of that station right to the bus, just as it was pulling out of the station. I took one final look, and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving goodbye. So that's the story of how I lost 5 pounds of sweat and ran faster than Usain Bolt. So I recently moved to a big city about 1,000 miles away from my hometown of very few people. Not knowing the area very well, I secured an apartment directly in the worst part of town. I'm a 24-year-old woman, and I'm pretty small, and I've always been weary of people because of a meth problem of where I grew up at. In this new area, there were gunshots about twice a week, every week, meth heads and homeless people wandering around, and all kinds of creeps lurking by the dumpster at night. The police were constantly at my complex for this or that, and would even ask us if it was absolutely necessary to come out when we called about stuff happening. I was on high alert 24/7, and always carried a knife and mace in case shit went down. One bad thing did happen to me while I lived there, and it was nothing that I could have ever dreamed I would experience. So it's 1 a.m., and I was home by myself indulging in some mindless Netflix movies when I hear the most erratic knock on my door. I expect it's the police coming to question me about some more shootings or gang violence like usual. No. I look through the peephole, and there is this crazy-looking, possibly methed-out lady standing there, looking terrified. So fearing that she may either be hurt and need help or try to hurt me, I grabbed my mace, stashed it in my pocket, and I opened the door to where I'm just barely peeking out. This is when I notice she's wearing a fucking hospital gown covered in blood. Just like a real-life horror movie, standing at my step with her crazy eyes, blood everywhere. She mumbles a bit and then asks me for water. So I say, "Sure, I'll be right back," and I lock the door behind me. I'm trying my hardest to stay rational and not freak the fuck out. I have some pretty substantial anxiety issues, so I was well on my way to a panic attack. So at this point, I think she might be really hurt, so I grab a bottle of water and decide to go out and wait with her with my concealed weapons until I can get the police there. I figure if she's really hurt, I can at least make sure she gets medical attention. Well, she obviously noped the fuck out of there, because when I opened the door to look for her, I didn't see her anywhere. What I saw instead was much, much worse. On my front step, where she had been, was a pile of bloody bandages, along with her bloody hospital gown. And on top of all that, there was a bloody fetus. I shit you not, a bloody, dead fetus. I will never be able to get that image out of my head. I've never been so terrified. I thought I was in the goddamn Twilight Zone, or some fucked up Stephen King movie. I called 911 and explained what happened. They knew it was necessary this time, and they were there in 3 minutes flat. They took pictures and cleaned up the step, and had 6 cop cars lining the parking lot, as well as the emergency responders. They filled me in, and apparently this woman was a drug addict, and her drug addict boyfriend tried to beat the pregnancy out of her. She was in the hospital, but I guess she escaped and wandered deliriously around the city and ended up on my doorstep. They had been looking for her after the emergency room called with a code yellow. I honestly felt so bad for her. She was probably harmless and didn't deserve what happened to her. I have no idea what happened to her after that, and I got the fuck out of that place the second my lease was up. My brother met his girlfriend a year ago, when he was 17, and she was 16. For a while, they seemed like they had a great relationship. My brother Alan and Jamie were always happy together, and Jamie made a real effort to get to know the rest of the family. However, I noticed that something was off whenever my brother wanted to go out with his friends without Jamie, and she would have a complete meltdown, screaming about how he didn't love her and how much he does for him, etc. This happened all the time, so eventually he started spending more and more time with her to avoid conflict. She even got annoyed at my mother's funeral because he wasn't paying enough attention to her. Okay, so what the fuck? Our mom just died. Chill out. Things started to get worse when she started accusing him of hitting her whenever he would try to deflect her from punching him in the face. My brother has some mild anxiety problems and was pretty messed up about our mother's death since they weren't on the best of terms before she died. He uses Xanax to try to self-medicate, which she knows, and would often pick fights with him to use his actions against him later on, or try to tell the school that he was on something to get him in trouble when he no longer wanted anything to do with her. Eventually, Alan couldn't take it anymore and ended the relationship a few days ago. A quick side note, our back sliding glass door is pretty weak. If you yank hard enough, you can force it open, despite it being locked unless we put the key in. The other day she showed up at 5 in the morning, banging on the door and demanding to be let in. My dad got after her and she left. This morning, however, she broke in through the back door and got into bed with my brother, who slept through all of this. My dad found her and told her to leave, or he would call the police. This afternoon, I heard my brother and his friend get back from school. All was well once again until Jamie broke through the back door, as she had taken the key this morning. Alan's friend stopped her from going into his room, and I told her to leave and not come back, or I was going to call the police. After she had left, my dad came back with 3 new keys made for the back door. My brother showed us her claims of her cutting herself, which we did a reverse image search and immediately found them, along with the fact that we didn't see any cuts on her arms. It's gotten so bad that my brother does not want to go to school since she follows him around and tries to get him to talk to her. And when that doesn't happen, she tries to get him into trouble. Jamie, I hope you get out of our lives and get the help you so desperately need. This story takes place 4 years ago and requires some history. I grew up pretty much as an only child in northern Michigan. I have an older sister who is 11 years older than me, who moved off to college as soon as possible. Because of this, I was extremely close to my parents. To this day, we're still best friends. One thing we all truly enjoyed was video games. When I was younger, I would sit and watch my father play Lara Croft on his computer for hours. I absolutely loved it. When I was 9, my parents introduced me to an MMO called EverQuest. We started off as casual players, but through the years and the game's expansions, we quickly advanced. By the time I was 17, I was playing non-stop. It was extremely hard for me to maintain an active social life, and because of this, I never had a boyfriend before. The three of us decided to apply to the highest ranked raiding guild on the server we played. That's when I met my ex, and the trouble really began. Within a few weeks, the raid leader had quickly taken a liking to me, and not wanting to upset him, we exchanged MySpaces. Yes, it was that long ago. I've always kept myself in decent shape, and would consider myself to be fairly decent looking. He only had one picture on his MySpace, however it was extremely dark and blurry. It raised a red flag that I quickly dismissed. From his MySpace, I learned that his name was Kurt, and he was 10 years older than myself, something that he had failed to mention when I was first talking to him. Because of his age, I kept our friendship that was quickly growing into a relationship for my family. We began talking for hours, late at night on the phone. Within 2 months of us meeting, he told me that he loved me, and I was ecstatic to finally have someone. The relationship had always been verbally abusive. If I didn't send him a couple of nude pictures or videos throughout the day, he would lose his mind and tell me how fucking worthless I am. He often reminded me that I wasn't pretty enough or smart enough to find someone else that would love me. And still, I stayed. 3 months after hiding our relationship from my parents, they found out. They did whatever they could do to keep us apart, including taking my phone, deactivating my MySpace page, and threatening to delete my EverQuest subscription. In the end, they inevitably failed, and being the foolish girl I was, I fell more in love with Kurt. Through the next couple of months, my mother had actually began taking a liking to him. He was extremely charismatic, and could fool anyone. He convinced me to move to Tennessee to be with him. Admittedly, I was excited about the idea. In August of 2009, by this time I was 18, I met him for the very first time. My parents were there to help me move into my apartment. They were somewhat wealthy and agreed to pay for the first 3 months' rent, as long as I got a job and finished beauty school as soon as possible. Almost immediately after my parents left to go back home to Michigan, things started going horribly wrong. The very first night I was there, I cried, because it finally hit me. I gave up my entire family and all my friends to be with this man. Seeing my tears upset him, and he began throwing himself at the walls, onto the bed, anything he could hit to try to hurt himself. He would tell me how worthless he felt for making me cry. A week later, I started beauty school located just down the road from my apartment. Everything was seemingly going fine, until I started making friends. I became close to 2 girls, and Kurt absolutely hated this. He would accuse them of trying to break us up and trying to make me cheat on him, even though they hadn't met him and didn't know anything about him. He wrote me up a schedule that I had to follow daily. I could go to beauty school, but I had to be home within 20 minutes of the school closing. I was no longer allowed to go out by myself, and going out to lunch with my 2 friends was strictly forbidden. He also began monitoring my cell phone. and only allowed me to talk to my parents when he was around, ensuring that I couldn't tell him anything without him knowing. A week later, he hit me for the first time. I don't remember what we were arguing about. I've always been more of the quiet type. I remember him punching me in the back of the head and falling. I remember laying on the floor as he screamed at me, kicking me in the stomach, in the legs, everywhere but my face. I heard him grab my cell phone and my car keys and put them in his pocket. I closed my eyes and pretended to be asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up and found my cell phone lying next to him. My car keys were nowhere in sight. I grabbed my phone and quickly left the apartment, making sure to make as little noise as possible. Once outside, I called my mom and told her everything that had been happening. My father had been in the hospital the day before for a major surgery, and my mother was already exhausted. She was also hysterical. She told me that she was going to call Kurt's father and tell him to get him the fuck out of my apartment and to remove all of his shit before she called the police. We never did call the police, and I'm still unsure why. Mostly fear on my part, I believe. She told me to go inside and to get my keys and get out of there. Her and my father would be coming down in 2 days to get me and move all my stuff back to Michigan. I waited a few minutes and went inside. Kurt was up talking on the phone with his father. He began screaming and throwing furniture around. He then viciously grabbed me by the hair and asked me how could I do this to him. I quickly brought up my right arm and elbowed him as hard as I could in the nose. I grabbed my purse and keys, which were on the counter. While my back was turned, he grabbed a knife and tried to stab me. I effectively dodged him and kicked his arm hard enough that he dropped the knife and was at the very top of the stairs leading up to our apartment when he grabbed the hood of my sweatshirt and kicked me as hard as he could down the stairs. I was on my feet, ignoring the pain throughout my entire body, and ran as fast as humanly possible. I made my way to my car, only a few feet away, and once inside, I looked back. Kurt was nowhere in sight. I assumed he went back to the apartment to damage my belongings. I quickly sped off and called one of the friends I had made. She was more than willing to offer me a place to stay. 2 days later, my parents showed up. I'm not sure who was in rougher shape, myself or my father, who was still recovering from surgery. I never saw Kurt again, nor have I been back to Tennessee. In hindsight, I definitely should have called the authorities, but I knew the kind of connections that Kurt had, and was worried what would happen if he ever found me or my parents. Before the bashing starts in on my parents, in their defense, they knew very, very little about the situation until it was over. My father was extremely ashamed that I was dating a man that much older than myself, and made it clear several times. I, however, was just too stupid to listen. First off, I want to apologize for any grammar mistakes I make. English is not my native tongue. I'm in foster care, and I recently moved into the basement of a house in a much nicer neighborhood. It was an affluent area, big houses, and not a lot of traffic. My room is in the basement of the house, and my view is into the backyard. There's a motion-activated light, but it only works a quarter of the time. Here's some pictures for a better understanding of the layout and view. Anyways, I'm an insomniac, so I'm always up way later than the couple I live with. It was late at night, around 3 a.m., so it was very dark outside, and I was in my room playing the night away on my guitar. My little lamp was on, and I had the window cracked open. I'm not an anxious guy, but for some reason, I felt like something was off. Like I was being watched. I brushed it off because the motion-activated light hadn't turned on, and I couldn't see anything or anyone in the thick darkness outside. At some point, I stopped playing and went to take a piss. As I came back into my room, I noticed that it was way cooler than when I had left. Again, I brushed it off until I saw my window had been pushed open. There's a security chain on my window that was broken. But in my sleep-depraved idiocy, I just wrote it off as my cat coming inside to eat while I went to go use the bathroom. Before I moved in where I live now, I lived in a seedy high crime area, so I'm always on hyper alert at night. I went to look just to be safe, and that's when I saw him. There was a person a few meters away from my open window, but I've been in my fair share of fistfights and physical arguments, so I wasn't really worried about him fucking me up. He obviously knew that I had spotted him, as we made eye contact before I sprinted for the window. I got there a little before him, but somehow he managed to get his fingers inside before I slammed the window down on his fingers with all my might. Hearing a horrible cracking sound as the heavy window hit his hand, he didn't try to retract his hand or say anything at first, but when I cracked the window open to do it again, he pulled away. I secured the windows, and he stood there with his bleeding hand held close to his body, with his eyes firmly locked with mine for about 10 seconds or so, before he ran off in the direction of the front of the house. I ran upstairs as quickly as I could, but he was nowhere in sight. I woke up the couple, but not before I checked all the doors and windows, and they called the police while I checked everything again, and turned on the lights in the house. The police took samples of the blood on my window frame, but it didn't match anything in their system. No one went to the hospital in a 100-kilometer radius with matching injuries in the following 5 days. To this day, I don't know who the fuck tried to break in, or if he had intentions worse than that, or if he's still around. The thing that bothers me the most is that he didn't run away when I first spotted him. I don't know how long he had been out there, lurking and spying on me in the darkness. So creepy guy lurking in the night, I hope your hand is severely fucked up. This happened just last year. A couple lost on a dark road sounds like the start to every horror story, so it's fitting that that's actually where this begins. It was early November, cold, raining, and around midnight. My fiancé and I like taking spontaneous late-night drives. We typically start out on one of the main roads within our city and keep following it until we hit the next town. Sometimes our drives last hours. The layout of my county and surrounding counties is a little bizarre. All of the cities and towns are isolated by large spreads of woods and country. I live in a relatively large college town, but a half-hour drive in one direction can land you stranded on a jagged, unmarked gravel road in the middle of nowhere, or in one of those weird small villages that no one knows about. It's actually pretty exciting, and that's exactly why we do it so much. So it's midnight and we're nearly lost. Willa, my fiancé, is poking around on my phone, trying to figure out what road we're on. We were on a mud path in a pit of country framed by small towns that we've never heard of. Flory, Winnica, and Tell or something. There were no other cars on the road. It's rainy and misty, and the headlights on my car aren't doing a damn thing. There are stands of trees and brush on either side of the road. We were heading north. She tells me that she thinks we're going to cross 200 Street West, which turns into Rye Road, which is a straight shot to Winnica. We made our way down the mud road for about a half an hour and never hit it. We've always had fun on these sorts of drives. This is the first time we've ever really been on edge. Willa says that we should have already found 200 Street West already, and asked if we passed it without noticing. I nervously ask if we should turn around, but she doesn't think we can without backing up into a tree or a ditch. I'm driving a Mazda, and it's an awfully wide turn. She begins to bite her nails while scrolling down on Google Maps. 10 minutes pass and we finally see a little back road snaking up a hill, branching off of the road that we're on. I quickly turn down it. It's very narrow, and twigs and branches are raking the doors and windows of my car. We complete the climb up the road, and we find ourselves in a wide paved clearing, with a house at the back of it, tucked into the woods. Willa doesn't miss a beat and starts hissing for me to turn around. The headlights illuminate the whole property, which is in major despair. No lights, windows shattered, siding and shingles shredded. The yard is littered with scraps and trash. Barrels, car parts, tools, hundreds of glass bottles, branches, slabs of concrete and rocks. and there was also a nasty old Chevy pickup. It looks like the house is sitting on top of all of it. Every inch of the property is entangled in nets of ivy and weeds. Willa points out moving shadows and glowing spots around the yard. There are dozens of cats all around, and they're all looking at us, and their eyes are glimmering from the headlights. I almost piss myself when a walnut-sized rock darts out of the bush and pops against the windshield. It fractures the glass. Willa screams and grabs my arm. "Denny, what the hell was that? Oh my God, what happened?" The rain is pouring in streams down the trees, over the house, and across the pavement. All the blood runs from my face. After a few seconds, a man stumbles out from the bushes and weeds, and he's carrying a fucking shovel. He was wearing a big dirty navy coat and has a beard. Then the screen door on the house opens up, and all the cats scatter. A tall, thin, spidery woman crawls out onto the porch. She had long, wild gray hair. She's just up high enough on the porch that the headlights don't reach her eyes. She whips her unusually dark hands on her skirt. I have no clue what was on her hands, but that's what I remember the most about her, how dark her hands were. She stares at us. Willa is screaming and crying and slapping the door lock repeatedly. I throw the car into reverse, rolling over cinder blocks and branches, and then screech back down the road. After Willa stops crying, and there's some distance between us and the house, I start to relax. Yet, when I get out of the woods and hit a long, straight stretch of road, I notice headlights behind us. I get a stomachache when I notice the car is mimicking all of our turns onto different roads. After nearly half an hour of being pursued, we finally reach Flory and pull into a gas station being visited by a few other people. I watch the vehicle pass. It's that same nasty Chevy truck we saw at the house. They stalked us all the way to the next town. We waited till the truck disappeared down the road before we got out. We grabbed some food and asked for directions. On our way home, I looked in the rearview mirror more times than I did at the road ahead. When we got back early the next morning, my teeth didn't stop chattering until I fell asleep. Thankfully, we still have night road trips and run into some really weird and cool things. We haven't encountered anything to top that creep though. Since telling our families about it, we've been told to be a little bit more careful about where we go. We've also stored a knife in the glove box. I also keep my rosary in my car now, in case, I'm dying and need to say a couple of last Hail Marys. I've driven back around that area during the daytime recently, and I've not been able to find it again. I managed to find the mud road that we were on, but I've not yet found the turnoff to that particular residence. My windshield has been fixed. Willa has suggested that we have locations in mind when we go out on night drives, so we're not driving around aimlessly. This story involves my encounter with a serial killer in 1996. I was 22 years old at the time and living in Terrebonne, Louisiana. I was living with my cousin and we were doing construction work, and our existence revolved around getting trashed on the weekends. One Friday night we went out with a coworker named Josh. We met Josh at this house in Houma and headed out. We hit the bars and I was determined to get laid. By 1 a.m., I had completely struck out for the night. I was at the point of my alcohol consumption that I wasn't going to have any success with the ladies. So we headed back to Josh's and couldn't manage to find our way back in our drunken states. We ended up in a section of town none of us had been to before. We came across another bar and Josh convinces us it's a good idea to go inside. Within 30 seconds of entering the bar, it's very obvious that it's a gay bar. None of us were gay, but we agreed with some prodding from Josh that we would stay and have a few drinks. I started getting advanced on by a heavy-set man. I make it apparent as quickly as possible that I'm not gay and that he should leave. He seems to accept this but continues to spark up conversation with me. I find him somewhat interesting, mainly due to his open sexuality, which I was new to. About a half hour goes by and the bar is dying down, and we continue chatting. He says that he lives nearby and that all three of us can crash with him and head out in the morning. At this point, he hadn't set off any alarm bells, especially in my drunken state. I convinced Josh and my cousin that the guy is cool and we can have a nice place to stay the night that's nearby. They eventually trust my judgment and we head out. We soon find ourselves in a small trailer park. We get to his trailer and things started to get fucking weird. He had a giant bulletin board with pictures of men on it. Under the men's pictures were descriptions like loose fuck, rugged butt, white boy tight ass tents, and so forth. Just weird shit. My cousin even comments on it, and he said that he likes to remember his partners. Oh, okay. Now please keep in mind that we were hammered out of our fucking minds, and we were just too drunk to give a shit and just wanted this night to be over with. In the middle of the night, about 4 a.m., we were woken up by him screaming,
"If you're gonna sleep in my house, you're gonna have to pay."
We naturally asked him what the fuck he was doing, but he insists that we were teasing him and wanted a good fucking. We eventually calmed him down and promptly got the fuck out of there. About 7 years later, I realized that the man was Ronald Dominique, who was eventually convicted of 23 murders of homosexual men. This was in 1996. I often struggle with guilt over if I should have done something and contacted the police based on the weird vibes he gave off and his inappropriate behavior. At the time of his conviction, I had long moved from Louisiana and was living in Northern Oregon. On a dark, cold night in the late 1970s, my dad's truck broke down about an hour from home. He started walking and put his thumb out hitching for a ride and was soon picked up by a middle-aged man in a brown sedan. My dad gets in the car. "Hey, thanks man, I appreciate the lift." The driver didn't respond. "I'm heading further up north. Where are you heading?" The driver again does not reply and begins to drive. Without even looking at him, the driver locks the doors and puts his hand on my dad's upper thigh and squeezes. My dad was about 24 or 25 years old at the time. He worked in construction, specifically drywall. He wasn't a tall man, but he was barrel-chested and stocky. My dad turns to face him. "I'm not into that, man. I just need a ride." The driver doesn't move his hand. After about 10 seconds of silence, my dad says, "Let me out of the car." Again, the driver doesn't respond. Doesn't even look at him. My dad grabs his hand and peels it off his thigh. "Let me out of the car, motherfucker. I will kick your fucking ass. Let me out now." My dad was ready to strike. Again, without a word and without even looking at him, the driver pulls over, unlocks the door, and my dad jumps out. He then peels off. My dad eventually arrives home and tells everyone about what happened. His family doesn't believe him. A few years later, he's dating my mom. They were watching the news, which was covering the arrest of a serial killer, John Wayne Gacy. My mom said my dad went pale. My dad jumps out of his chair, shaking violently, and started screaming and pointing at the TV. "That's him. That's the guy who picked me up." My mom said that she believed him immediately. My dad wasn't much of a liar or a prankster. He was blunt, rather quiet, and didn't really crave attention. I was so intrigued by this incident that in the late 90s I read a few books on Gacy, including the one written based on his interviews. Gacy picked up countless hitchhikers over a multi-year period in the 1970s. Sometimes he would pick up hitchhikers and take them wherever they wanted to go, without incident. The timeline, details, and geography, the MOs are all consistent. My theory is that Gacy picked up my dad thinking he was younger than he actually was, and then he tested out my dad's reaction. My dad was a bit older than Gacy's target age of 18 to 20. When my dad fought back aggressively and immediately, Gacy figured he wasn't worth the trouble and possibly also realized that my dad was not as young as he looked. A few years ago, my partner and I were at an event, and we started chit-chatting with a couple seated at our table. The female of the couple turned white and stared at me, mouth agape. She told me that her uncle had an almost identical encounter with Gacy. I just feel so bad for those who were unable to escape. Growing up, I would occasionally ask my mother if she had any real-life scary stories she could tell me. She chose not to mention this one until I was old enough to hear it. When my now-deceased grandmother, my mother's mother, was in her early 30s, she decided to drive to our town's convenience store after dark to pick up a couple of things. She had finally just managed to get her 4 children to sleep and left my grandfather to take over while she hopped in a car and made the 10-minute drive. Back then, the road from their house to the store had very few neighbors and was mostly just woods on either side of the 2 lanes. After buying the couple of things she needed, she left the store and jumped back into her car, pulling out onto the road for her route home. A minute into the drive, she routinely checks her rearview mirror. Instead of seeing the usual empty road or a set of headlights, reflecting back was a man's face in the back seat. Scared to death, she instantly hits the brakes, hard enough to shock this man, probably giving him whiplash. She then jumps out of the car and begins screaming loud enough so the people near the store could hopefully hear. Having this man's plan foiled, whatever his plan entailed, he took this opportunity to escape the car, running into the woods and out of sight. After getting back from the store and calling the police, my grandfather found a cloth covered in chloroform in the back seat. It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. After searching for the longest time, she had found her dream car and was planning on traveling the 900 kilometers to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand 2-door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of color, and I must admit, I did not share her obsession with it. But with her being the closest thing to a sister that I will ever get, I was happy to join her nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, from the cradle and onwards, sharing each other's love for adventure. We traveled the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21 and had recently returned from a trip to Asia. The man who was selling her the car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Umeå. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it had started to snow heavily, the first snow of the season no less. The parking lot was almost empty when I saw the man standing outside the Vitara. I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country live a lifestyle with fishing and hunting, so there was nothing really strange about that. But still, there was just something about him that made me uneasy. He was really nice though, smiling and waving to us, and shaking our hands before walking us around the car and pointing out all the tiny little flaws. He showed us the work he had done on the car, and showed us the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs. He gave the impression that he didn't want to hide anything. On the contrary, he made a show out of being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified, and we were getting cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I got the paperwork at home. Let's close the deal over some coffee." Against all my instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, the both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man, who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than the alarm bells going off inside my head. I can't tell what it is that made me feel that way, but there must have been some sign that something was wrong, something that my subconscious had picked up on. The man was constantly talking. Funny, since people from the north of Scandinavia are famous for never speaking a word more than absolutely necessary. He showed us the stereo, told us about the features of the car, about the places we drove past, about the wildlife and nature. There was not a silent moment. After about 20 minutes, I started to notice that we were in no way moving in the direction of civilization. Instead, it seemed we were driving further and further away into the vast wilderness. It struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, driving us into an unknown territory, and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man telling us stories about the area, and noticed that she didn't look at all worried. Maybe I was totally overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road, hunters planning their day or taking a break maybe. This is truly a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally stopped outside a small wooden cottage with no neighboring houses, apart from a small cabin that we drove past a few hundred meters down the road, but it had looked like it was empty. We followed the man inside. He was still talking non-stop and continued to do so until the moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now, a thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too started to feel that something wasn't right. "I'll put the kettle on," he said. As he passed us to go into the kitchen, he let his hand touch Hannah's hair, and then he smiled, smugly. "May I use your bathroom?" I asked politely, and made my way to a door with a little red heart on it. I was washing my hands when I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror. Something was hidden behind the water cistern. I pulled out a rolled-up plastic folder, and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. It was very violent porn pictures that looked like they had been cut out from magazines. They were glued together to the paper, surrounded by cut-out pieces of handwritten text. Put together, it made a horrifying story about how a woman was lured in a car with the promise of getting to buy the car cheaply, and then it quickly turned into a horror story. I know this is going to sound silly, but when we traveled together, Hannah and I had a code word for whenever we felt it was time to get out of a situation. We had never needed to use it, just joked about it, but now it came in handy. I walked out of the bathroom and looked at Hannah and said, "Potatoes. We forgot to buy potatoes, and that's too bad, because good God, we need some." The look on my face must have told her that the situation was no joke, and she said, "Oh, should we get some as soon as possible?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty and charming, and capable of great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen, tapped him on his shoulder and said, "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I can go have a quick look at the cam belt." He said something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We got into the car and sped off. We left the car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he reported it stolen? It would be embarrassing to explain to the police. But nothing happened. He didn't follow us, didn't report it in. We had to take the train since we no longer had plane tickets. The original plan was to take the car home, and we didn't want to linger close to the airport in case he came looking for us. Later, Hannah asked me what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I found. It might have just been a fantasy, or a sick game, and maybe he never would have done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced that we would die if we didn't get out. Thank God Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just the code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, about how we would handle a situation where we needed to get out fast, things would have ended much differently. Both of us knew that if we ever used the code word, it was time to get out. No questions asked. Just move. I'm a 21-year-old female, and my name is Shauna. I grew up in a little town in the Boston area. Back in my hometown of having about 3,000 people, everyone knew everyone, and nobody locked their doors. Because of the no crime to little petty crime there was, this is important to remember. I had just moved to Las Vegas, Nevada with my family. I live with my mom, dad, 2 sisters, and 2 dogs. I just moved here about 3 weeks ago. I'm a huge zombie fan and a doomsday prepper. Please don't judge me. So I have a collection of knives and machetes on my wall. In my new house, me and my sister's rooms are all upstairs in one corner. My parents' room is right across next to the stairs and bathroom. Once you go downstairs, you're in front of the main entrance. Past the front door is the living room, and then the kitchen with a sliding glass door that leads to the backyard. My dogs are usually outside, but I've not learned how to use the doggy door yet. My dogs do not like anyone who are not the 5 people in my family. All of this is important information. Now let's get to what happened. I was still behind on unpacking, so I was in my room trying to figure out where to put all my stuff. My older sister started college and was on a softball team, and she had a game that Saturday night. I hear my mother come up the stairs and knock on my door. "Hey, you want to take a break and come to Alex's game tonight?" No, I'm okay. I'm gonna continue unpacking. How long are you guys gonna be? Is everyone going? Yeah, we're all going. Maybe 2 hours tops. Will you be okay? Yeah, I'll be fine. Remember to let the dogs out and call if you need anything. My mom leaves and I hear the car drive off. I am now home alone, but I don't think much of it since I'm 21 years old and I can handle myself. I really had no idea how much I was going to be put to the test that Saturday night. I was watching a scary movie and folding my clothes when I hear a car pull up next to my house. We moved into a dead-end street, but where I used to live was a main road, so this kind of freaked me out because I wasn't used to hearing cars slow down near my home. I brushed it off as a neighbor and that I was just being paranoid in a new house. As I'm going to put some things in my bathroom, something caught the corner of my eye outside the window. I went over and opened the window, listening for anything, but I could hear and see nothing. However, I thought I saw someone run behind the big-ass cactus on the side of my house. I go back in my room and see a light flash by my window, kind of like a flashlight. My room light was off, so it was really bright, but I assumed it was headlights or something, even though I couldn't hear a car running. Later I walked downstairs to get something to drink and let my dogs out, completely ignoring the red flags as some people call them. I let my dogs stay outside while I finish upstairs so they can run around. Back at my old house, my dogs didn't have a lot of freedom since we lived on a busy main road with no fence. So then I walked back up to my room and locked my bedroom door. I lay in bed and I guess I fell asleep. I was asleep for maybe about an hour when I heard my front door open. I thought my parents had come home early, or perhaps it was my little sister, so I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. But then I heard 2 sets of heavy footsteps, and then the doorknob to my room started to jingle. My parents always knock and announce themselves before opening my door, so I knew something wasn't right and bolted straight up. Then I heard a female voice from the other side of the door softly say, "Shit, it's locked. Why would it be locked? I thought you said no one was home." "I don't know. Jesus, shut up. It's probably locked with a key and they went with the family. I told you all 4 people left in the same car. I'm not stupid. Who gives a fuck? Let's try another one." I froze, nearly shat my pants. 4 people. 4 fucking people. So they've been watching my house and have no idea there's a 5th person in the family. I just moved here, so I have no friends, and there shouldn't be anyone in my house besides my family. I'm breathing heavily and covering my mouth so they can't hear me, tears streaming down my cheeks. I get up and move towards my wall. As I mentioned earlier, I have a knife collection, so I went and grabbed my biggest machete, and I walked to my door, putting my ear against it to listen. It's quiet. So I quietly unlock it at the same moment I hear my parents' door opening, and I take a quick look to try to size up my opponent. There was a man, maybe about 5'11", 150 pounds, wearing all black with a ski mask, and a female, maybe about 5'5", and 120 pounds, wearing the same exact thing, except you could see her knotted, gross red hair. They both had bags. So I run to the bathroom, right next to my room, trying to inch my way towards the stairs so I could get to the front door. I came up with the best idea ever. "I have a machete, and I called the police. You better run," I yelled at them. I didn't call the police. I should have, though. Fear makes you do the stupidest things, I swear. And I'm also only 5'4", 125 pounds, not intimidating in the slightest. Then I heard the female say, "Shit, Ryan, what the fuck? You said there was only 4 people in the family. How could you fuck this up again? And the girl has a machete. What should we do with her? Take her with us?" Apparently, Ryan responded, "I swear I thought there was only 4. I guess we'll have to. She'll call the cops." I wasn't having any of this in my own goddamn home. I apparently grew some balls. Rather than being scared, I was more furious to hear that. No fucking way they are taking me anywhere or touching me. I got so mad that anger got in the way of the smart thing to do, and I yelled back something so stupid, I'm still mad I even said it. I put myself in more danger. "You ain't doing shit with me, you stupid assholes. Get the fuck out of my house before I fuck you up." So stupid. I then ran down the stairs as fast as my little legs could carry me without falling, turning all the lights on as I hear them following me down the stairs after me. As I round the corner by the front door, the girl grabs my arm and yanks me back to the ground. While trying to hold my hands behind my back, the guy tries to tie my hand with rope from his bag. "Oh, some of my friends are gonna like a young girl like you. I promise we'll take good care of you," he said with an evil smile that seemed to stretch on forever. His teeth were yellow and black, and his breath smelled like garbage and death. The girl, smiling in the same way, leaned in and said, "Aw, don't be scared. I promise you'll have lots of fun." But I guess they forgot I had the big-ass machete, and I twisted my arm free and cut the guy's forearm from wrist to elbow. Blood went everywhere. It soaked me and the girl from head to toe. As he started screaming and clutching his arm, I kicked the girl in her stomach and started to run for my back door to let my mean-ass dogs in. But as I was jumping over the child gate we used to keep my dogs in the kitchen, the girl grabbed my leg, which causes both of us to tumble to the floor, and my machete skids across the kitchen. I felt completely helpless seeing my only weapon about 5 feet away from me. So close, but so far. I've always made fun of people for saying that they had a fight or flight moment, but that's exactly what happened. I chose to fight. This is my goddamn house. I just started throwing punches, trying to do everything I could to get this disgusting, BO-smelling girl off of me. She gets the upper hand and flips me on my back, so that now she's straddling me and takes her hands and puts them around my neck and starts squeezing. She squeezed so hard I could feel my eyes unnaturally coming out of their sockets. I felt my whole body go warm, like I was outside on a hot summer morning. So hot, I just started sweating, gasping for air, my vision going blurry, head throbbing like a million needles are pricking the inside of my skull. I feel my heart beat in my head and hands, slowly accepting my fate, seeing my childhood, becoming sad that I will never see my family again. I will never play with my dogs again. Everything was sad, not painful. At the same time, I just knew right then and there, I was dead. I'm crying and screaming, looking for anything to stab her with. I am completely filled with sadness, but all of a sudden, the most beautiful sound comes, and I start crying tears of joy, even though I cannot breathe and I'm about to pass out from lack of oxygen. The sound was of the dog door opening and closing. My big-ass mean dogs have figured it out. They must have been watching from the glass door and ran around the house looking for a way in, and found it. As I'm seeing stars and I'm about to black out, my dog jumps over me and grabs the girl's arm by his teeth and starts tearing it to shreds. At this moment, the guy sees she's in trouble and starts to get up, which surprises me since he's lost a lot of blood. But before he gets a chance to do anything, my second dog walks up and starts growling. As I'm laying on the floor, gasping for air like a fish out of water, my whole body feels like pins and needles, and really burning hot. I muster all the power I can, and I walk, pick up my machete, and say, in a very low and raspy voice, "Don't fucking move." Since I didn't call the cops in the bathroom, I grabbed my phone off the kitchen table. Thank God it was still there from where I ate lunch earlier that day. While still holding my machete, I rang the police. The whole time, I never told my dog to stop tearing that girl's arm apart. I wanted that bitch to die. I didn't care since she almost killed me. That bitch deserved it, and I still think that to this day. When the police got there, they arrested the both of them and had me come out to a cop car to call my parents while they took pictures and did an investigation. My parents showed up crying and worried. They drove me to the hospital where I found out the worst of my injuries. I had 2 broken ribs, a sprained wrist and foot, a broken nose, cuts and bruises all over my body, and 3 broken fingers. I stayed in the hospital for 4 days, and right before I was released, the cops who came to my house that night came to visit me for a follow-up. The couple were boyfriend and girlfriend, who would wander neighborhoods looking for for sale signs and stalk the houses until someone moved in, then would stalk them longer to know when everyone left and how many people lived there. I guess they didn't realize that I didn't go with my family that night, or thought there were only 4 people in my family, and clearly didn't realize I had 2 big dogs. Once they felt they knew the setup, they would break in, except in my case, walk in and raid the place for money and anything to pawn. They were also wanted for kidnapping, assault and battery with a deadly weapon, burglary, and drug charges. And the guy was also wanted for 3 rape charges. The kidnapping and rape is what really scared me. I now know what would have happened if I actually passed out. I wish I could say they went away for decades, but no, they only got 5 years. After I got out of the hospital, my dogs got new beds, toys, and treats, and all the love I could give them. They saved my life, and I am forever grateful for them. I couldn't imagine what would have happened if 1, my bedroom door wasn't locked, 2, if I didn't have my dogs, and 3, if I wasn't a doomsday prepper. I'm pretty sure they had something bad planned for me.
There's always a reason to be afraid.
Roughly 12 years ago, when I was in high school, me and a group of friends, not real ones, trespassed at an abandoned building in my town. I was hesitant to even step foot on the property, but I was coerced into following them. It was horrible to say the least, but because I wanted to fit in, I kept close. I didn't know much about the place outside that it was possessed by extremely negative auras for various reasons. Come to find out, it was a sanitarium for over 30 years, then once shut down, became a very poorly practiced hospital. This led me to ask questions because I'm naturally curious. They took me to the basement, where supposedly the sanitarium would do electroshock therapy and dispose of waste. I was pushed over the edge. All of them called me names and belittled me, so I just turned and slowly went to leave, when some noise started to all of us in the far back of the basement. They all just rushed the stairs, shoving me to the side. I fell and tried to get up, but there was this heaviness around me. I looked back only to see nothing. No light, no stairs, no basement. All I heard was my name, almost as a whisper. Stupidly, I responded, then saw what I honestly believed to be 2 yellow eyes. They looked despondent and almost longing. I picked myself up and ran out, still hearing my friends rushing to escape. Once I left, though, they all came flooding towards me asking where the hell I had been, saying that I had been gone for like 10 minutes at least. It was only a few seconds for me, though. Now that you have that part of the story, here's what's happening currently. I have been diagnosed with COVID and am not doing overly well with it. Constant cough, chest pain, pre-existing ulcer acting up causing internal bleeding and almost always on the verge of sweating. Nothing good has been coming from this. But it gets worse, as I'm having a nightmare that I haven't had since 2011 when the manor was condemned and then demolished. I would see the eyes, in corners and side views, and they were almost always gone by the time that I would notice. Except now, in 2020, it's in my head. I'll be dreaming normally, and then I'll hear my name as a whisper and jump awake. Each night for the past week, I've been hearing my name randomly in my apartment and in my dreams, but have started seeing those eyes again. I've talked to a few people about this, and some say that my spirit had been seen by something on the other side. Basically, I'm familiar with them, and they can find me now. Others said that when I fell, that the heavy feeling was a piece of my soul being pulled away. That's why when it was demolished, I saw the eyes and heard the voice again. Either way, with COVID happening, and this happening at the same time, I just don't know. Everyone seems to start these stories with, "I'm skeptical, but..." And this time won't be an exception. I'm not an atheist, though. So, my friends and I had a bottle of gasoline. Trust me, this isn't supposed to be a funny story. We're all car guys, so we sometimes have some contaminated gas left over. Anyways, we wanted to get rid of it the only way possible for teenagers to think of. Burn it in a field to see fire go woof, and the empty bottle go boom or whatever. The 3 of us, giggling, made our way to the nearest cornfield that had an opening, apparently from a truck making a U-turn or something, as the farmers had been planting the corn. We decided to get as much stuff to burn as we could. Dry leaves, bunches, etc., to make a huge campfire and help warm it up with half a gallon of 92-octane gasoline. It burns really well. Both of my friends were filming the whole process as I poured gasoline all over the place and made a line of gas going from the pile of the dry stuff. One of them said, "We're summoning Satan," and all of us kinda laughed it off and didn't pay much attention to it. The whole thing went pretty well. No one got hurt, we didn't set the jungle on fire or anything, just fooled around quite a bit. My buddy's phone started breaking down while filming though, and in a weird manner. The recording continued, but the picture turned black and white, and what seemed like it copied itself and pasted 8 red-tinted, semi-transparent, smaller versions of itself on the screen in a grid-like pattern, and then it stayed like that for a few seconds before the phone turned off. We just laughed at our friend's now broken Galaxy S3, yeah, it happened a while ago, and went home as it was really dark by that time. The next morning, my other friend, who had filmed it all with my Galaxy Note 2, and I waited to meet the S3 guy to complete the trio and discuss the way that we gained world dominance by the evening and such. When we saw him come up to us, he was pale as hell and his eyes were screaming terrified. Turned out his phone was all right, and even saved the video with the glitch as it was. And he watched the video right before coming to us. You guessed it. He saw what he thinks was either a demon or a ghost. As the image on his screen collapsed into the same red-tinted shatter, he turned away from the fire to see better and get a grasp of what had happened to his phone. The camera pointed away from the fire into the corn, where there was quite a distinct black and white silhouette of a ghost-like creature looking at the flames. Well, yeah, you could take it for a glitch or a glare in the camera lens, so we didn't think too much about it. The creature, if it existed, which we doubted or sure as hell wanted to doubt, was standing right next to us as if it were a fourth friend just looking calmly at the fire with us. Then we decided to watch the video from my phone to make sure that it was just a glare. We wanted to be able to sleep tight with no worries, but we wished that we hadn't by the end, as there was yet another, this time a more distinct figure to be found. Just as this other friend pointed the camera the same way that the first guy did. A face was staring at us, with an evil smile. Just a face peeking out of the corn. No body, no nothing, with no glares that looked like that or were the same color or any other glare at all. Days and years passed. We're still kinda skeptical about it, or at least try to be. But with all the facts combined, we, to this day, still can't find a reasonable explanation for it. We even tried to repeat the thing with the fire and took a bunch of cameras with us, but we chickened out to do it at night, as we had done the first time, so no luck. So, years from now, being an adult car guy, I have about 20 gallons of bad gasoline I would never use for any car out there. If I make it out alive, get ready for Chapter 2. This is 100% real, and frankly, one of the scariest things I've ever had happen while being engaged with the paranormal. My sister and I had gotten a Ouija board about a year prior to this, which is the summer of 2019, on July 4th. We had gotten the board around October of 2018 that previous year, and we had been playing with it in our house. Inside of our house are a variety of spirits. We've managed to make close friendships with a few of them. One of my best friends, again, this is weird to say considering he isn't alive, is a spirit named Sean. And while we are friends with the majority that live in our house and around different places in the neighborhood, there are a few that we have kept our distance from. When we first met the spirits, we learned through the board that we had an evil entity living in our house by the name of Victor. Apparently, Victor was criminally insane when he died, and has since turned evil. The other spirits told us he was residing in the office downstairs, and to never under any circumstances play with the board in there. Another spirit that used to live in our house was named Liam, and the spirits told us that he was basically, quote-unquote, Satan incarnate. He had since then left, so the only problem that we had per se was Victor. Victor mostly left us alone, besides a scary instance where he tried to possess me in my sleep. The next day, the spirits told us that this was through the board, and I woke up with holes indented all over my wall. The holes, the spirits said, were bullet holes that Liam shot, because apparently he was back. When they told us Liam was back in the neighborhood as a ghost, I was extremely nervous. I had done research about ghosts like him, and nothing good ever came out of them being back. I tried to forget about it until learning that Victor had essentially left my house, and now he and Liam were both residing in another neighboring house a couple of streets over. Well, me being me, obsessed with horror, Halloween, gore, and everything else mysterious and or scary, I decided that I wanted to go and see that house. As mentioned, it was the 4th of July, and my sister, our neighbor, and I ditched the celebrations and rode our bikes to the address where they were supposed to be staying. The spirits had given it to us the day before, again through the board. Now yes, this wasn't a good idea. The last thing that you want to do is provoke an angry spirit, but I didn't really care. I wish I had, and recklessly rode on with my companions in tow. When we arrived at the house, I stopped in front of it, but my sister and neighbor kept riding their bikes. I called for them to stop, and instead they picked up speed. I was confused at first because I thought it was a joke and was laughing a bit as I kept calling their names. At one point, my neighbor and my sister turned around at the same time to look back at me. When they did, I saw that their eyes were widened and blank, and that they had eerie smiles stretched all across their faces. Instantly, I knew that this was bad. I picked up speed, and by this time, I was terrified. Both of their bikes were swerving into the street, barely missing oncoming cars. I was horrified that they would be hit. I remember crying and pedaling as fast as I could, and that was when I knew that they were possessed. Eventually, I ended up following them back to the street my house was on, and tears were streaming out of my eyes. I had never been so scared in my life. Their bikes rode into the yard of a random person, and they both toppled to the ground, flipping over the handlebars. I dropped my bike as well and ran over toward them. They sat up together, blinking. I was hyperventilating, hugging them both as tight as I could. I had honestly thought that they were going to die and that it would have been my fault. They were confused as to why I was crying and what had happened. I found out that neither of them remembered anything except turning into the street. They didn't remember riding the bikes, almost getting hit by multiple cars, or anything else at all. They had totally blacked out. After I had calmed down, we went back into my room and played the board, wanting to figure out what had happened. Apparently, Victor and Liam had possessed my sister and neighbor because I had come by their house and wanted to screw with me. Needless to say, I didn't go back to that street for the rest of the summer. I used to live in an old farmhouse down in a much less populated area, which had always given me a feeling of something close to dread, whether I was alone in the house or not. More often than not, a chill would run down your spine in this house. For this story, only my little brother and my parents will be mentioned, my little brother of which had an imaginary friend. It had started on a rather cold and rainy day. I recall because my brothers and I had to play inside, so I decided to hang out with my little brother in his room, which was rather large with a built-in closet big enough for at least 2 people to sit in if they wanted to. On this day, I had asked to hang out with him. That's when he asked his friend if I could. He said yes, but his friend wanted to play a particular game. He wanted to play hide and seek. I didn't think much of it at the time, so I just agreed. My brother was first. He had to count in the kitchen, so I went around trying to find a hiding spot. That's when I went back into his room to see the closet open wide. For context, it was an old closet that had a locking mechanism on it, though we never had a key. I had jumped in and closed it behind me and was just waiting. And I waited, and then waited some more. I felt like I was in there for over an hour at the time. I was just about to give up, and tried to open the closet to get out, but nothing happened. I tried again and again, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it. Loud wheezing coming from beside me. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear and feel what was beside me as it had touched my leg with its skeleton-like fingers. I felt paralyzed as its hands, if you could even call them that, went from my legs up to my stomach and then to my throat. This thing was choking the life out of me, and all I could do was sit there with tears flowing down my face. But the worst thing I remember, something that cannot leave my mind, was its voice. The thing had begun giggling in what seemed like a child's giggle, but was distorted in some way that I could not explain. In a stroke of luck, or maybe even fate, just as I was at the point of no return, I heard my brother's voice shouting. He had given up trying to find me. I could hear him as he walked into the room. I began knocking as loudly as I could, and the voice and the grip just disappeared, which was when I began screaming and crying as I burst from the closet without any trouble. My brother took one look at me and began to cry as well for our parents to come in. Of course, as parents do, they ran to see what was wrong and found me on the ground as I was gasping for air, crying my heart out. I then blacked out for an uncertain amount of time, and when I woke up was in the hospital with my family sitting beside me. They looked at me with what I later learned was a mixture of pure joy to see me awake, and pure concern about what had happened. I told them everything. I have never seen anyone go from concern to absolute terror so quickly as they tried to press me further, but I couldn't tell them more than what I knew already. Not long after, the doctors came in to check on us, along with an officer to question my family, and then to question me, as I was almost choked to death. But the doctor had shown that the choke marks were much too thin, almost skeletal, to match anyone. I then told the officer everything. They ended up searching the house in case of a break-in or anything like that, but came up empty. Later that day, my brother came to me to apologize for what had happened. I was confused and asked what he meant. What he told me next chilled me to the bone. After I had agreed to play hide and seek, his friend said that he would help find me and would look in his room, which was why he didn't actually look there in the first place, but did come looking after he couldn't find me, which was when he found me in my condition. To this day, I'm not sure that thing wouldn't have killed me if my brother had not come into his room when he did, and to be honest, I'll be happy to never find out. Alright, that's it for this video. What did you all think of these super creepy demonic encounters stories? As always, I love them all, but I won't lie, the one about being strangled in the closet freaked me out a little bit. And it could have been something else aside from a demon, like a disgruntled or angry spirit, of course, but it definitely seemed worthy of inclusion here, and I thought you'd all enjoy it. I wanted to ask you all a quick question, as this is something I've been considering doing in the future, but am really on the fence about it. I don't want any of my subscribers to ever feel like I'm begging or asking them to donate to the channel in a way that makes anyone feel obligated or uncomfortable. So that's why I'm running this by you all right now, because I want you to let me know how you feel about it. Would this be something that bothers you, or do you just not care at all? I may also put a poll up about it in the community feed later to really get everyone's thoughts on the matter once and for all, since I know not everyone makes it all the way to the end of the video chats. Anyhow, what I'm considering is a fund sort of like the wine funds that I've seen on other creators' channels, except instead of it being a wine fund, this would be a pet fund. So basically, I noticed that you all really love my pet updates in the community feed, and I wanted to offer a way for those who would want to do so to help with our pet food and pet care needs. Obviously, as I mentioned already, this wouldn't be me specifically asking anyone for money, and I would never want any of you to feel that I've done that on the channel at any point. This would just be like a side option for those of you who love the pet updates and would want to see more and more of those adorable pics of the cats and our other animals, because we have a veritable zoo here at the house, everything from cats to frogs and snakes. It is full, believe me. To be able to donate toward only if you want to. So like I said, let me know what you all think about me adding that link to my video descriptions and channel page, just for those interested in doing that. And if you're all okay with it, that would be awesome. Now, don't forget that if you have your own horror story that you'd like featured here on the channel, whether it be true or an original horror fiction story that you've created that you'd like to share, all the contact links are available in the description, along with my Patreon